Okay, welcome to lesson 12. This is responding effectively. So there's 4 objectives. So in this lesson we're going to talk about how to respond and the 3 ways to respond. So the first objective is to understand the 3 ways of responding effectively. Also, I'm going to talk a little bit about how do you develop a thorough response. So I want you to sort of learn what does a thorough response look like and how do you do that. So after this lesson I want you to read Graph Chapter 4. It's called Yes, No, Okay, But, 3 Ways to Respond, and it's on pages 55 through 67. So read that chapter from Graph that kind of emphasizes what I'm saying here about responding. He has some different techniques and strategies as well. It's a good companion to this lesson. Also, I want you to do Journal 3. So I'm going to have you read a short article from the Graph book. It's called Junking Junk Food, and the author is Judith Warner. So as you can tell, we're on a little bit of a theme here. And it's pages 400 through 405. So after you read that essay, I want you to do Journal 3. So for this journal, I want you to summarize Warner's essay using at least 3 quotes. So we've been talking about quoting. Make sure you use at least 3 and do them in APA style. And then I want you to respond to the essay based on the things we talked about in this lesson using at least 3 paragraphs. So this one's a little bit more thorough of a summary response. This is really a warm-up for our first essay, which after this lesson I'm going to give you the assignment sheet for the first essay. But before moving on to that lesson, do this Journal 3. Email it to me at brooks.winchell@go.cambridgecollege.edu, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible, and I'll give you a grade between 1 and 4. And then after you get a grade, as long as it's 3 or 4, move on to lesson 12, which will talk about the essay. So let's start with a brief review. In lessons 9, 10, and 11, I discussed bringing others' ideas into your writing by summarizing, quoting, and citing effectively. So lesson 9 was summarizing effectively, lesson 10 was quoting effectively, and lesson 11 was using APA style and citing effectively. So all of these lessons are designed to help you capture what they say, which is one of the most important parts of academic writing, like Graph talks about in the book, presenting other people's ideas. This is what they say. However, once you've captured others' points of views, it's important to offer your own opinions, or what I say, as Graph puts it in his book. What's your point of view based on the opinions that you've just read? Just like Burke describes in his Parlors, once you feel like you've caught the tenor of the argument, you put in your or you offer your opinion. So when you offer your opinion based on other people's opinions, you're responding. Since you're in dialogue with what they're saying, you're responding or reacting to what they're doing. So it might seem like there's many possible ways to respond. But when we think about it, it's a whole bunch of yeses and nos, right? And that's because really responding boils down to 3 types or 3 ways that we can respond at the core. We can either agree with what an author's saying. We can say, yes, that's true. I agree with what you're saying. We can say, no, I don't. I disagree with what you're saying. Or we can do both. We can sort of agree with some things and sort of disagree with other things. This graphic captures the actually not very many ways to respond. So the first way to respond is by agreeing with what an author says. And although agreeing might seem easy, it's actually probably the most difficult way to respond is to just agree with what an author is saying. And it's hard to develop this because when we agree with something, we have a tendency to say, oh yeah, it's perfect, everything is fine the way it is, and we don't add or bring anything new to it, right? So for example, if I asked you do you agree with Zinchenko, his don't blame the eater, and you do, you might say something like, I agree with Zinchenko completely. It's true that fast food companies are everywhere and their food is unhealthy. We should demand that they label calories more. In this particular example, the author doesn't really add anything new. There's nothing new in here. All it's doing really is just parroting back what Zinchenko has to say. These are all Zinchenko's ideas. I agree with him completely. It's true that fast food companies are everywhere. Their food is unhealthy. We should label calories more. So this response really doesn't have much value, since it doesn't really bring anything new. What's the point in reading this response? Somebody might as well just read Zinchenko's essay to begin with. So in this sense, a really good response adds something new. You need to say why you agree and bring in some of your own ideas. You want to think about your own experiences or what you've learned in your life. If what an author's saying matches with your experiences, what you've seen, what you've learned, add an example of one of those experiences that you've had. For instance, you could say, I agree with Zinchenko's point that fast food is everywhere. Near my house, I have 2 McDonald's restaurants and 1 Burger King. But when I think about it, I don't have anywhere healthy to eat. Even the grocery store is far away. This is a much more valuable response because the author's not just parroting back what Zinchenko says, she's taking it into a new direction. She's adding her own example. Near my house, I have McDonald's. She's corroborating what Zinchenko says and telling us about her experience. So there's a good way to agree, is add something new from your own experience. So in addition to adding an example, you could compare what one source says with another source that corroborates. So you could say something like, I agree with Zinchenko that fast food restaurants need better labeling. I read a research study by Smith, 2010, on how vague fast food labels are. In that study, the author says that only 30% of people could accurately read labels. So in this example, this is obviously from a research. The author was reading several sources about fast food and labeling and found that this one corroborates what Zinchenko says, so she brought it into her response to help support why she agrees with Zinchenko. So there's another way that you can develop your responses when you're agreeing with authors. However, sometimes you might want to disagree. Disagreeing is actually a bit easier to do. A lot of people are combative by nature and want to challenge what an author has to say. But when you disagree with something, you've already thought about it, and you've come up with examples or ideas that go against what an author has to say. This is why a lot of people find it easier to disagree. So in order to develop a response that disagrees with an author, just bring in those contrary examples or ideas that you've already thought of that made you disagree with the author in the first place. So you might say something like, I disagree with Zinchenko's point about fast food restaurants leading to obesity because many fast food restaurants are much healthier these days. For instance, I often eat at Subway, Chipotle, or Salad Works. These places make some very healthy meals, So here again, the author's taking it into new territory when she's disagreeing and saying, the reason I disagree is because, in my experience, Zinchenko's wrong. Fast food restaurants are actually healthier. Subway is relatively healthy, Chipotle's relatively healthy, and Salad Works is extremely healthy. They only have those in Boston, by the way. So you could also mention other sources that go against what an author says. So in addition to elaborating with your own experiences, what about a source that contradicts the author? So you could say, Zinchenko says there should be more regulations on fast food, but this would amount to what Radley Balko calls government intervention. Balko points out how limiting what companies can and can't do goes against everything that America stands for. And we could go on and talk more about Radley Balko's point of view, but he would definitely be in disagreement with Zinchenko. Whoever wrote this response here was obviously doing some kind of research and had read several articles and dialogue, and listened to Balko and thought that Balko made sense and said, yeah, I disagree with Zinchenko as well, because other authors have better points that go against what he's saying. So those are ways that you could develop a response that disagrees. But the most sophisticated, the most realistic and open-minded type of response is usually one that agrees and disagrees. So for the same reason it's important to bring counter-arguments into an argumentative essay, where you're acknowledging the other side, it's also important to be able to see both sides of an author's perspective in your response. So you might mostly agree with what an author has to say, but is there anything you disagree with? Do you really 100% agree with an author? Do you 100% disagree with an author? Usually there's one or two smaller things that you can find that you disagree with when you primarily agree. So if you look, there's got to be something. At the very least, you should be able to imagine why somebody might disagree with the author or what that other perspective is. So in this sense, I don't think it's very valuable to completely agree or disagree with something, because you want to at least entertain why would somebody have the opposite perspective. So for instance, you could say something like, I agree with Zinchenko that fast food labels are vague. I have seen da-da-da and da-da-da, and give your own experience, and that could be a whole paragraph. However, I can see why calling for stricter labels might be a problem. As Radley Balco says, too much government intervention might hurt some of our rights. Right? So here's a good example of an agree, disagree. Right? And those could easily be a paragraph each. So there are the three ways to respond: agree, disagree, and both. You do want to make sure that when you're responding that you use specific examples or support from sources to develop your response, but you also want to make sure that your response is multifaceted, like this diamond that has many different surfaces. You want your response to have many different surfaces or many different angles. You don't want to just respond to an author's overall points, but try to respond to most of the author's subpoints. Right? Zinchenko, in his article, his main point is that fast food companies need tighter control over labeling. But he kind of also examines several minor problems with fast food companies. So he says fast food companies cause obesity. He also says there are no alternatives to fast food companies. He also says they label incorrectly. And he says they market to children at the end. So even though his main point is we need tighter control, he does have many sub-points that he makes about fast food restaurants. And if you start examining these in a more multifaceted response, you could easily develop a response that was, 4 paragraphs with a paragraph on each of these. Also, if you start looking more closely at sub-points, you're probably more likely to both agree with some and disagree with others. So for instance, you might agree that fast food companies don't label their products incorrectly, and that there aren't a whole lot of alternatives, but you might disagree that they cause obesity and that they market to children. And here we could have a much more complicated response to the essay that's more thorough. So that's what you want to try to do when you develop a more multifaceted response, is pick several different points to respond to in the essay. So lastly, you want to keep in mind when you're transitioning into your response. So in lessons 9, 10, and 11, I talked about whenever you're bringing somebody else's ideas into your writing, you need to make sure you give appropriate credit. Remember, we had that Mr. T graphic, give credit where credit is due. Make sure you use signal phrases to give credit to the authors whose ideas you're using. However, you also need to let the reader know when you're moving into your ideas and take credit for what it is that you're saying. Right? So the best way to do this is to make a clear transition into your response. So if you're doing a summary response, first summarize an author's ideas, right? And then move into your response, but make a really clear transition that moves from the summary into the response. So I think you can and definitely should use I think this, I think that, right? Because that tells the reader this isn't from another source, this is your actual idea. After reading Zinchenko's article, I mostly agree with his point of view. So in this case, it's clear that this person is moving into a response because it says I, and it gives us the sort of general aim of the response, mostly agree with his point of view. So we're going to hear in a thorough response about the different reasons for why she agrees, but we also might see a little bit about why she disagrees. Or you could say something like, overall, Zinchenko makes several strong points that I agree with. So there's just another way to transition from a summary into a response. And you mention I, and you're saying the general trajectory of your responses agree. So let's wrap it up real quick with this lesson. So after you summarize an author's ideas, you should move into a response to that author's ideas. Make sure you transition clearly from your summary into your response. And then when you get into your response, make sure that you're either agreeing, disagreeing, or both. Really, you just want to do both. And no matter which type of response you make, develop it with plenty of examples from your own life or things you've seen, or support from other authors that back up your ideas. Finally, make sure your responses are multifaceted in that they take on multiple points. So I'm going to have you move on to lesson 13. But before you move on to lesson 13, I want you to read Graph Chapter 4, Yes, No, Okay, But, 3 Ways to Respond, and that's on page 55 to 67. So make sure you read that one on responding. Also, I want you to complete Journal 3. So I want you to read Junking Junk Food by Judith Warner. It's pages 400 through 405. And then for Journal 3, I want you to summarize Warner's essay using the strategies we talked about, using at least 3 quotes in the ways that we talked about, and then respond to her essay with at least 3 paragraphs. So you're going to have somewhat multidimensional response here, and I want you to try to develop those responses with either your own examples or with some of the other sources that we've read. So that's it for this lesson. So after you do this, email it to me. I'll give you some feedback, and then you'll move on to Essay 2 assignment sheet, and I'll see you there in lesson 13.